Please join me in welcoming Juliet.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, Lizanne, for inviting me today. What a wonderful turnout. I really appreciate you coming out today to hear about mental health. There's probably about 40 or 50 people in the room, I would say, for those of you who are listening in. And before I actually get into my presentation, I wanted to introduce you to somebody who's really special to me. And as you can see from the first slide, you can see a photo, and this photo is actually of Justin Haynes, and he was my brother. Now, Justin was an amazing individual, really gifted, very talented. You might have heard of him. If you Google him, and you can go ahead and Google him, you'll find all kinds of information about his musical career. As well, he was really funny. And, you know, he lived in Toronto. He was the father of a son who's now 13 years of age. And throughout his life, he really struggled with mental health challenges and mental illness. And he lived in poverty and eventually became homeless. And for a time last year in December, he spent some time at Seton House, which is a really large men's shelter located in Toronto. And after spending some time there, he became even more of an advocate for people that he considered to be really worse off than himself. So even though he was struggling, he still fought for the underdog and would give his last cent to anyone who he felt needed it more so than him. And unfortunately, Justin, at the age of 46, he ended his life by suicide in March of last year. And I think the struggle with mental health and also with living in poverty just became too much for him. And even though he was surrounded by the love of friends and family members, and even with all of the training that I've had, none of us were able to prevent his passing. So when I speak to you today about mental health, it's certainly something that I'm very passionate about on a professional level, a personal level, and also through my volunteer work. And it's something that it's so important to raise awareness of, that I appreciate the opportunity to be here today and that you're all participating in Bell Let's Talk today to start the conversations that are sometimes challenging to have. So as I go through my presentation, I'm hoping to share with you some tips on how to create a more, sorry, I'm just going to advance the slide. Cole is my trusty assistant here today. All things technical. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking with you about how we support someone with mental health challenges. And we begin by actually creating a safe and supportive work environment. So it's fabulous that Hydro Ottawa has invited the Royal here to speak today and participate in Bell Let's Talk to help us to improve those conversations. I still do things old school, so I have my paper notes here. So much of my experience with working with others comes from my work with clients and families, more so than with colleagues. And of course, you know, my talk today will come from that place, more so than focusing on anything to do with liabilities or legalities. I am, after all, a social worker and not a lawyer, so I will just keep to what I know best. So we hear a lot about mental health and mental health challenges and mental illness. And I wanted to demystify some of those terms for people because we use them interchangeably, but actually there are some distinctions. This is a definition that the World Health Organization has put out, and it's basically a state of well-being where individuals realize their own potential. They can cope with the normal stresses of life, they can work productively, and they're able to make a contribution to their community. That seems about right. So what would mental illness be then? Well, the Government of Canada defines mental illness as being characterized by alterations in thinking, in mood, and in behavior. It's often associated with significant distress and impaired functioning. So some examples of mental illness would be bipolar disorder, other mood disorders, anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, substance use disorders, those sorts of things. 1 in 5 or 20% of Canadians actually experiences mental illness. So we likely all know somebody who experiences mental illness. That's about 7 million people living across Canada with mental illness. So when we think about support, support really begins with an attitude, having an open mind. And thinking about mental health and mental illness in new ways, it's helpful to think about mental health along a continuum. And that continuum can start with being healthy, mentally healthy, and it can go across to having mental health challenges, mental health problems, and then, of course, having mental illness. We can probably all place ourselves on this spectrum. And it helps us to think about how we all experience stress and vulnerabilities. Even those of us who are functioning well can have bad days. We still have our resources, though, and our strengths. And that's similar to people that have mental health issues or mental illness. They also have abilities, strengths, and resources. They're not all about their illness. It's perhaps easier to tell that somebody needs help when they have a physical health problem. It's easy to see if somebody has a broken arm or a broken leg, and we can suggest or recommend logical steps to take. But how do we know when someone is experiencing mental health challenges? Looks may be deceiving, especially with mental health. It can be hard to tell whether someone is experiencing mental health challenges or whether they're experiencing stress. We may experience stress at home or at work that may be a mental health challenge, but not necessarily severe mental illness. This slide shows examples of physical, psychological, and behavioral symptoms that might indicate mental health challenges. We may notice changes in behavior from our friends or colleagues' usual. They may be quiet, withdrawn, express difficulties with concentration, become irritable or easily agitated, erratic, experience mood swings. But let's not jump to conclusions and assume it's a mental health issue when in reality, someone may be just having a bad day or going through a stressful time. One person's anxiety may not look like another's. It's a very individual experience. Most mental health issues are moderate and not severe, and they can fluctuate. Many people may continue to attend work and function well by managing their symptoms effectively, whereas other people may have developed coping strategies and adapted and may not even be aware that they have mental health issues because they're coping with them, and it's become their normal. We can only know for certain if someone confides in us, but often, due to fear of discrimination, stigma, or shame, people are really conservative about talking about their mental health. So what do we do if we notice somebody appears off? If we have concerns, how can we open the door to having a conversation? So first, we can start by becoming more aware and educating ourselves. So it's wonderful to see so many people participating in a presentation like today because it's a great starting point. We can also read books, and there's many different websites that we can go to. As well, we can start speaking to other people and sharing our experiences. We have family groups at the Royal that are open and free to the public, and people are able to come and listen to other people that are experiencing similar challenges. And so I brought some flyers with me today that would be potential resources that you might want to take away. And I think Lizanne is also going to circulate links after the meeting today. We don't need to wait for a crisis to happen before educating ourselves and becoming more aware. We can be more prepared if we plan ahead. To counter stigma and open lines of communication, we can change our language. The Mental Health Commission of Canada has provided this list of less stigmatizing language options. Like many other people, I've certainly said, "That's crazy," or "You're nuts." But now I've learned to say, "You know what? That's really interesting. Let me think about that." Instead, just as the right kind of language can help convey acceptance and understanding when talking about mental health challenges and mental illnesses, the wrong kind can add to the stigma and rejection people with mental illness so often encounter. To emphasize the difference that language makes, I will give you a personal example. So rather than saying that my brother was a crazy, bipolar alcoholic who killed himself, I say that my brother lived with severe mental illness, struggled with substance use problems, and died by suicide. Can you hear the difference? Much more compassionate and less judgmental. We don't call a person with cancer a canceric. So why do we call a person living with schizophrenia a schizophrenic? People are more than their illnesses and still have abilities even with illness. We need to overcome discrimination by changing our language, speaking openly, and building connection by letting go of these stigmatizing terms. This creates a safer space where people may feel that they can open up. In terms of conversation, a good starting point is to listen respectfully and empathetically and without judgment. We can then open the door to engage in relationship building activities and the person themselves rather than focusing on their illness. We can be inclusive and focus on shared activities such as playing games or going to a movie, looking at photos, walking in nature, rather than saying, "What's up with you today? Are you on your meds?" We can also ask for support for ourselves, remembering that everyone has strengths. We all have good days and bad days, and not every issue or quirk is due to mental illness. Asking for help is key and invites other people to respond with their own experience. So now that we're equipped with an open mind, have educated ourselves, and are prepared with more respectful and less stigmatizing language, we are ready to have a conversation. We start with active listening, stopping all other activities, including scrolling through our cell phones, being truly present, avoiding distractions. A good practice to show we are truly listening is to actually repeat back what the person has shared with us to convey that we understand and to ensure that we've understood correctly. Remember, we don't have to agree with what people are saying, but by demonstrating acceptance and understanding, we can let them know that we respect their feelings. This can be quite validating and can be really useful in de-escalating a situation. Listening for that grain of truth in what someone is saying, or finding something that you can support with a yes, can be so helpful too. In asking for something or saying no to something that we don't want, we use I terms. A common formula in assertive communication that I've been taught in a number of different places is to use the phrase, "When you do this, I feel this." Now, in trying to actually use that phrase, I've found that when I say you, it can actually trigger shame or blame in the other person, and they become defensive. So wherever possible, I try to remove the you from the phrase, and I also add what my preference is so that people are more aware of what would be preferable or what I would like them to do instead. We can also take this communication style one step further, and we can show how it might be of benefit to the other person if they were to comply with what we're asking. So I'll use an example that's pretty common to most people. I've heard many people have issues with the dishes. I don't know if you can relate to this, but if you walk home at the end of the day and you walk into a kitchen and the counter's covered in dishes, what is your typical reaction? Okay, I hear some laughing. I can relate. You know, I would often be very frustrated if I would walk in from work and find the place a mess, and then I'm expected to cook supper. And so what obviously I've worked on boundaries, and I'm going to get to that. But one way of dealing with that by using this I term statement is to say, when I get home from work and see dirty dishes on the counter, I feel frustrated. I would prefer the kitchen would be clean so I can start supper on a positive note. Then we can eat dinner together and it'll be more enjoyable. So I'm taking the you out of the sentence, and that really does help to diffuse the situation. Of course, there's lots of times when we would have to reinforce this message, and we can work towards it, but you get the idea. It's also important to focus on one priority at a time. We want to be brief and succinct and remain calm to have effective communication. So now we're wondering, okay, well, when, how, and what do I say? When we're thinking about when to have a conversation to be effective, time and place are really key. We want to choose a time when the workplace is calm, there are no immediate time pressures, and we have somewhere private to talk. Sometimes people will ask one another about going out for a coffee or getting outside for a walk together. Being truly present is important, so we want to make sure that our undivided attention is given. So how do we do this? How do we have a conversation? Well, remember to listen non-judgmentally. We want to avoid shaming, blaming, and being skeptical. We want to take people at face value. We want to be kind and respectful to help people feel valued and accepted. And what do we say? Well, we open the door with open-ended questions. Open-ended questions start with what or how, and they can open the door for fuller conversations. If we ask why questions, they're closed-ended, and they lead to yes and no answers, and sometimes people feel defensive because you're asking them why. So some examples of open-ended questions are, how can I best support you? What do you need from me? Rather than asking a why question like, why are you so cranky today? It's important to be genuine and let people know that we care, and also be honest if we are concerned. So there's also some things that we want to avoid doing. Whether people come to us with a problem or we notice a problem, we aim to keep our language neutral. We want to give people time to answer and try not to press them with too many questions. We want them to share as much or as little as they want to. Let them lead the discussion at their own pace. Don't put pressure on them to tell you anything that they're not ready to talk about. Talking can take a lot of trust and courage. You might be the first person that they have been able to talk to about this. If it's a family member or a close friend that you're concerned about, they might not want to talk to you at all, and we have to avoid taking this personally. It's also important to avoid participating in hurtful gossip. Your feelings are key to knowing your own limits. Feelings of resentment, frustration, feeling overwhelmed or exhausted are signs that a boundary might need to be set. If you are an approachable type person and find people come to you because you are good at listening, you might find it difficult to establish boundaries and yet feel like you are getting overly involved or that being supportive is interfering with your own ability to work. Imagine if you're really busy. If you have a pressing deadline, but you still want to be of help to somebody. This is an example of where a boundary might need to be set. And it's really important to remember that as much as we want to support people, our family members, our friends, and even our colleagues, some of us are counselors and trained therapists, but we can't even work directly with our own family members. We have to recommend that they seek resources elsewhere. So we might say, your situation sounds really tough, and I would like to listen. I need to focus on my work right now. I would prefer to meet you at lunch when I can give you my full attention. Maybe you'll go for a walk or have a coffee then. And at that time, when you have some one-on-one with them, you might want to offer to go to the family doctor with them or help them to reach out to the employee assistance program, another friend or a family member. There's also community resources available that could be helpful. And when the crisis arises, we've actually left some cards around with some crisis numbers on as well that you can reach out to. It's important to reassure people that there's no shame in reaching out for help, and you're glad that they shared with you. Remember that 1 in 5 experience a mental health issue in their lifetime, so they're not alone. There's other people that are experiencing a similar thing. We want to avoid the temptation of taking control and allow them to make the decisions while also maintaining our own boundaries. We may need to restate our boundaries, and sometimes we feel like a broken record. Stating a boundary and enforcing a boundary are two very different things. We have to be mindful of not crossing our own boundaries. Sometimes people will repeatedly ask us for things, and then in turn we need to repeatedly set our line in the sand. And it's hard to do, especially when we're emotionally involved or emotionally connected to somebody. Communication and boundary setting are the most popular workshops that we offer at the Royal. Whenever we put on a group about communication or boundaries, we get a full house with standing room only. We can all benefit from improving and practicing our communication skills. It's not easy. It does take practice. So I recommend to people that they actually practice with small things when they're learning to set boundaries rather than going for the big things. You know, and then as you gain mastery, you feel more confident and you're better equipped to be able to set boundaries with people that are close to you. So that is really a basic foundation of how we can support someone and also create a supportive work environment. Considering those tips together about education, language, communication, and boundary setting are really important and key as a starting point. There's something else, though, that we need to think about when we're thinking about supporting others, and that is self-care. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time on self-care before wrapping up today. So we hear this term self-care quite a bit. I mean, sometimes I'm waiting in the grocery line and I see on the cover of magazines the importance of spending time in self-care, but it's a bit of a mystery, you know, what is it? Often, too, our families attending our groups at the Royal come to us with a question, and their main question, their main drive for coming to our groups is to say, basically, how can you fix my loved one? How can you get my loved one to go to treatment? How can you get my loved one to take their medication? How can you get my loved one to go to the doctor or believe that they have an illness? This is a struggle. And they think that if only their loved one would get the help that they need, they would feel okay too. And the work that we try to do at the Royal is to actually help them see that they can be okay whether or not their loved one gets the help that they may or may not need. We have to remember that sometimes we might notice something and suggest something, but people may not follow through with our suggestions or our advice. And that's really hard, and it can feel disheartening. It's another reason to practice self-care. So here I'm reminded of an old social work joke, and I'm going to share it with you, even though it's super corny, because it's about a light bulb, and this is hydro, and I figure you'll all relate. Okay, so the old social work joke is, how many social workers does it take to change a light bulb? Nobody wants to guess? None. It has to want to change itself. Yeah, it's a groaner. But it's so true, right? I mean, when we think about our realm of control, we really only have control over ourselves. And what we can change are our own reactions, our own responses, but we have very little power over other people. We do, though, have an opportunity to be a power of influence by our behaviors, our language, how we convey ourselves. So it's really important to remember some of the points that I made today. Some of us are also naturally caregiving type people, and we have to remember that although it seems easier to look after other people, the kind of care we give to others, we also need to give to ourselves. We cannot give from an empty cup. In order to help others, we have to put on our own oxygen mask first. Self-care is not selfish. It's self-compassion. Self-care includes setting boundaries and prioritizing time for ourselves. Self-care is key to looking after our own mental health. Years ago, I read a book, and it's a really popular book. You may have heard of it. It's called Don't Sweat the Small Stuff. Now, the author of this book, he writes about getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning to pay himself first before he gives of himself to others. Now, getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning is very early. But, you know, I read this book 20 years ago, and I started the habit of getting up at 5:30 every morning. And I have a routine, my self-care routine, that starts right in the morning. I read inspirational literature. I, of course, scroll through social media as well while I'm drinking my coffee. And I make sure that I exercise. I feel if I exercise in the morning, then I stay true to myself, I've built a healthy habit, and I don't get too tired by the end of the day and procrastinate. So those are habits that have been with me now for 20 years, and they've kept me healthy and mentally healthy too. Establishing quality time with yourself is really important. I had a friend of mine who felt that he was overly committed. His schedule was very busy. So he decided to pencil me time into his agenda. And he decided that if somebody else were to call him up and ask him to take that me time spot, he wouldn't cancel his plans with himself. After all, if we canceled our plans with a friend, what kind of friend would we actually be? This really stayed with me, and it's something that I've considered, you know. A similar example was provided to me by my yoga instructor. She said, we have to be kind to our future self. Well, one of the ways that I'm kind to my future self is that no matter how tired I am at the end of the day, I always preset my coffee maker. By presetting my coffee maker, 5:30 is a lot easier to get up in the morning. I can smell the brew, and it makes me happy right away. Another thing I've learned, though, is that my energy really fluctuates throughout the year. And I used to make commitments based on the energy I had in the summertime, but by the time January would come, I would be totally burned out and tired. So I've adjusted my schedule to recognize that I'm more able to do things in the summer than I am in the winter. And I practice more relaxation now in the winter, and I honor that balance and that energy. So self-care does not mean expensive trips to the spa or massages, although those are super nice options if we have them available to us. We can even create that kind of experience at home with a very small budget, right? Like we could all have a hot bubble bath and invest in some nice fluffy towels and light some candles and indulge in some chocolates. And so we can create that haven in our home space. It's important to think about what helps you to decompress. Self-care is really about that. One of my favorite hobbies is knitting. I knit constantly. I knit every day. It's something I think about when I'm away from my knitting. I might even be a little bit obsessed about my knitting. But you know, that's the way I really like to relax. I find it rhythmic and soothing, and it really does help me wind down. My partner is a real fire buff, and he loves looking at fire trucks on social media and also funny memes. That's what makes him really laugh. And, you know, recently he broke his arm and he had to modify some of the activities he engaged in. He broke his arm playing hockey, and of course he wasn't able to do that. So he thought, I'm going to go stir crazy if I'm not able to work or, you know, do what I normally do. So he decided to join a City of Ottawa gym where he goes swimming. And he's really been enjoying swimming. And as his arm has got stronger, he's also started playing badminton. These are two totally new activities for him that he's tried that were an opportunity out of a hardship. And so we're really lucky here in the City of Ottawa. You know, we have lots of bike paths and trails and gyms and, you know, other activities that people can partake in. I also like to run outside on the trails, more so in the summer than in the middle of January, but I do run. And I wanted to share with you that I am actually a team captain for the Run for Women at the Royal. So the Run for Women's team name that we have is SWEET, and these are some of the team members. I only started running in 2016, you know, and I started with a 6-kilometer run. But last year I was able to run a full marathon. I was 50 last year, and I thought for my 50th birthday, I am going to run a marathon, and I did. And let me tell you, it's a huge accomplishment, and it was a lot of fun too. It kept me training, and Tracy was there cheering me on. So many people engage in physical activity for the physical benefits, right? Like we think about our heart health, our cardiovascular system, but we don't think about physical activity as much about mental health, and yet it really has helped my own mental health. You know, in my family, there is a history of mental illness. And I think many of us in Canada experience depression and anxiety, especially in the wintertime. And I found that running has really helped me to cope with those mood swings, mood fluctuations that I can experience, as well as helping my heart health and my physical health. So I have a top 10 list for why I run or move for mental health. And this is my top 10 that I'm going to share with you. So it's definitely improved my resilience, my overall health. I get fewer colds and flu bugs just because my body's getting heated up, so I think it's killing some of those germs. It's definitely helped my mood as well. Helps me process stress for sure. Helps me to feel calm. Helps me to think more clearly. Just stepping outside at lunchtime, you know, taking a break from the computer and going for a run or a walk around the block can really help me to re-stimulate my mind. It gives me an opportunity to reflect and process my day. It helps me to sleep easier. It helps my productivity and creativity. I actually tried knitting and running on the treadmill. Let me tell you, not safe. It gives me more energy and vitality, and it's improved my self-esteem. And you know, as we age, these days we talk a lot about dementia and Alzheimer's, and running and moving can actually help prevent cognitive decline. So my overall message is that when we take care of ourselves and we feel better, we're better able to support others. So the change really does begin with me. Thank you.